Good morning. I don't know if it's afternoon now. Um, my name is Greg Gondwe. Um, uh, I study China in Zambia. And my topic, as you see, is disappearing narratives. And basically what I'm trying to see is, uh, the disappearance of China in the African media. And of course, I'm being kind of broad when I say China. I'm kind of focusing on anything that talks about China. Basically, this is an extended study. I started this study in 2015. And what motivated me was, I grew up in a very small town in the northwestern part of Zambia. And during that time, for example, we had those thatched houses, and my family is still there. And every time I talk to my young sister, she would tell me the changes that are happening. She would say, "Oh, you remember that place? Now it has this supermarket, and all kind of stuff." And every time I had the opportunity, I would find things different. And today, it's a very different place. So that's what piqued my interest to studying China and Chinese investment in Africa. And then I made this my dissertation, where I actually looked at China itself in the Zambian media and how the media are actually embracing it. What is common in there? What are they saying? What's the tone? So yesterday at the beginning of the conference, I was surprised that Zambia was not one of those that was indexed among the 10, but I think it also gave me some reasons that my study here might explain. So I studied this. This was part of my dissertation. Of course, it's not the same thing. Most of the data that I'm using here is from my dissertation, and I've collected more, and I'm still collecting more actually to extend this to see whether there have been changes. So just to give you a brief background, I think the relationship between Zambia and China started in the 70s. Of course, at that time it wasn't the media. It was where China actually helped construct the Tazara railway line, which connects Tanzania and Zambia. And again, it will come up. It came up this year actually to revamp that. So at that time, I don't think there was any relationship between the Chinese media or Tanzanian media. And neither probably were stories or Chinese coming to live in Zambia as we see it today. But 2012 came, and I think that's where we see China kind of declaring its intention officially that they want to come back and invest in Africa. Ignore those, but basically what I did was I looked at all the media outlets in Zambia. This might not be a full reflection, but those are kind of the same. So I went through each of the media outlets in Zambia and then categorized them into ZNBC, which is public media or government media, and then we had private media, community media, and religious media. Again, ignore those calculations. I just picked this up from my old study. And then I started looking at where or can we find stories that mention China in any of these categories. And once I did that, I also looked at what kind of issues are they reporting about. Is it government policy? Are they talking about investment? Is it culture? Is it education? Is it politics? And things of the kind. Then another thing that I looked at was, are these stories routine? For example, are they just reporting something that happened, let's say, or the president, the Chinese prime minister has said this, or are they analyzing? Do we see stories that are enterprising? Are they talking about maybe the problem of sanitation within the community that is connected to the Chinese place? So those are the things that I kind of categorized and also started measuring the tone. What is the tonation of this story? Is it positive? Is it neutral? Or is it negative? So this was from 2012 to 2017, 2018. I found that there was first an increase of stories from 2012. The stories were increasing in all the 4 categories of that I made. So we had ZNBC, we had private, community, and religious. So we see them increasing like almost every year. We had more stories, and with 2017 being the peak of a lot of stories in each of these. And then from 2017, we started seeing the decline. That was the end of my dissertation. But last year, I revamped this and I started looking again at what is happening. So what I saw, even in terms of routine stories, we saw a lot of routine stories in all media categories, and then we had intermediate stories where most media shared the stories about China within their own categories. And then there was, of course, enterprising stories. But in this case, you're seeing religious and community actually reporting much on stories of enterprise. So, for example, they'll talk about what is China doing in their communities. They'll talk about, maybe environmental pollution. They'll talk about maybe water sanitation. Or they even talk about the positives that China is doing in their community as it relates to enterprising stories. So these are not just stories about who has done what or has done what, but it's a story that is analyzed and people actually telling us the implications. And of course, as we see afterwards, we continue to see the decline, both not just in routine stories or enterprise or entrepreneurs, but as well as in tone, yeah. So this is kind of the updated one, where now I picked up stories and compared them to 2012, from 2012 until 2024. I'm still collecting those stories, of course. I'm waiting until December, and my analysis already shows me that there has been a complete decline in stories about China in the Zambian media. If you Google stories, you'll see a lot of declining aspects to it. But then what we are seeing is that, there's a decline in the number of stories. There's an increase in kind of routine stories, especially for government media. And then there's an increase in the tonation, which is a positive tone. So the negative tone of China is going down. And in other media outlets like religious media, there's barely any story about China anymore. Community, yes, they are also declining. Even within private media, we don't see many of those stories. So the decline is very prevalent. If I ask somebody, say, tell me anything about China in Zambia right now, I think most of people will be grappling with what is happening. Now the question is China really in Zambia, or has it just disappeared completely? Contrary to what Professor Emeka said here, I feel like the presence is now felt among the civil society, especially on social media. There's a lot of things that are being reported on social media, but then the challenge is that these things are not making it into the mainstream media. And I think that's where now my study comes in. We have the disappearing narratives within the mainstream media, and yet some of the things are happening within social media. We're able to see the presence of China within these. And these things are not like just simple stuff. These are things that could actually make newsworthy stories. I want to share one of the stories that appeared, and it never appeared in any media outlet, but it's about a Chinese man who owns a store in Zambia, and what he does is he employs the locals and to go and sell that stuff around town, and then in the evening they bring him the money and things like that. But if they don't bring that thing, actually he punishes them by beating them up, and that's on camera, and yet we never saw that anywhere else. I don't think we... Anyway. Yeah, so I don't know how to do this. But basically what we're seeing is this guy actually, punishing him. And there's somebody that is talking, said, next time if you don't bring enough money, we are going to actually increase the lashes and we'll make it stronger. And that is on camera. It happened in 2023 last year, and none of those probably in Zambia saw it except those that follow this guy, and then it was never in the media. So these are some of the stories that are actually being ignored by the mainstream media. And then we might think that stories that actually highlight Zambia about China that actually speak positively about it might also make it. After the FOCAC this year, I think Zambia received a grant to revamp the Tazara railway line. It's about $1 billion. If you look for that story in the Zambian media, there's nothing. So it's only things like Voice of America, CNN that reported on that. The question is, do we have journalists in Zambia that can actually report on that? Yes. The problem is that story was already reported because most of the stories that are reported are routine stories. So it would be a redundant thing. But we don't have any journalists that went to actually talk about the implications of these stories. What does this mean? No. So it's a project that is going on, but no one is reporting on that story. And that's not kind of a negative thing, it's a positive thing, but we don't see it into that. So when we look at the media, we start asking, for example, the silence, are they just being silent, or is this complicit? The first thing is I've met, and basically when I was doing a study, I interviewed some journalists. I found that many of them attempted to do that, and they received a backlash. Some of them were actually threatened with jail time and the kind of stuff in the name of national security. Sorry, I'll jump to that. So anyway, basically what I'm trying to say is, one, the presence of China is not that much felt because, of course, the idea of soft power is prevalent, and I think in the past few years, we don't hear the name soft power anymore. And many of us do study China by looking at the formal structures, and that's what I've been seeing, where we want to see what China did, let's say, in these bigger projects. But in reality, what happens, or what we find in this study is that China is involving itself in a very subtle way, in a way that probably most of us would not be interested in studying it. So for example, those stories, barely any of us would actually want to study posts on social media. Maybe we would think it's fake, and all kind of stuff. But it also calls for us to actually pursue investigative stories in that sense, So yeah, there's that aspect where we see that, and then there's also another aspect where China has gotten into, especially the media, so much. For example, for me, I knew that it was 60%, it owns 60% of the government shares, but Dr. Mtambo here talked about 100% now, because Zambia could not actually sustain the 40% or 60% of the initial agreement. So if that's the case, then China controls the content, or China decides what has to go in and what has to go out. And in any case, China decides not to be present in the media. So social media can happen, but still, who controls social media? We have a lot of, we know that our governments are major, buyers of new technologies from China. So they have the power to actually control that and be able to sustain whatever is on either social media or in these media outlets. So basically, that's how we're seeing the absence of China, at least in the Zambian media. There are a few remnants, and at least those stories that I'm seeing are all routine stories where they're reporting about what happened, what the president said. There are very few or barely no stories about discussing the implication. What does this mean to the local people? Or any stories about the environment or things of the kind. So way forward, I think, there's need for us to empower journalists, in whatever that means. It's challenging to work in such kind of an environment, but the question is there a way that journalists can actually be empowered to pursue stories that are not routine stories, but stories that actually interrogate things on grassroots? And the example I gave of, issues happening on social media of human rights abuse, and yet they don't make it in the mainstream media, And then, of course, we've had journalists, and all of us, I think, studying here, we're talking about China, being a bad guy in this sense. But then the other question is, do we interrogate our governments as well? I think that's what I saw missing. We don't see journalists actually writing a story and reporting, let's say, about the contracts that their government signed. Why did you sign this? Did they ask the ministers why they decided to sign that contract? Immediately jumps to China. China has done this and that. So I think there's need for us to emphasize and push for local journalists to actually also, question their leaders, question their government about some of the decisions that they're making. And then, lastly, I think as researchers, I feel like we also have to diversify our population samples. It's easy for me to just study what is being created. For example, I'm able to analyze a document by the government or by China. But the question is, do we go on grassroots to interrogate or to ask people that are really involved within that aspect of or that situation to actually get diverse perspectives, so to get stuff that nobody cares about. So, yeah. So basically, I think those are the three things that I feel like we might want to be looking at if, let's say, we want to push an agenda that also supports people on grassroots. Thank you, and I'm happy to respond to your questions. Yes, I don't know. Okay, whoever.
I think, thanks for the great presentation, Greg. Mine are two quick questions. One is that, you seem to suggest in your recommendations that we boost what we call legacy media, legacy journalism, our usual print media, broadcast media, and so forth. But the reality is that all these media outlets are under siege. I think across the continent, I do not need to, give you examples of newsrooms, cutting down on staff, downsizing, operating. In fact, now editors are reporters, editors, designers, everything rolled in. And this is from South Africa through Kenya to Ghana, Nigeria. So in these circumstances, the old investigative journalism that we used to see might not be quite feasible. Instead, we see this happening elsewhere. So how do you respond to that? Because how do you respond to the fact that what you're proposing doesn't seem to be feasible in view of the collapse or the death of old journalism as we knew it? That's one. Number two, many of the contracts that are signed between African governments and Chinese are opaque. And I think the word opaque has been used quite a bit here. They are secretive. There's lots of non-disclosure agreements and so forth. So if you are proposing that journalists go to ministers and other government officials and demand to see the contracts, and yet the contracts have been signed under secretive terms, how do you undo that? And in fact, in situations where governments also don't respect access to information, statutes, and so forth. So it looks like your recommendations are hitting a brick wall almost immediately. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I'll be answering while I think they'll give. Yeah, so the first thing, of course, there's no straightforward answer in this case, and most of these recommendations might just be a call to action, like, what if journalists worked for certain organizations outside the government? Would they be able to pursue, investigative stories? But then another thing that I've found, ignored among most, most media outlets is religious media and community media. Basically, for example, it's rare that people study religious media, especially when it comes to content. Why? Because many of us believe that their content is just religious. But when I studied this, I found that some of them were actually addressing issues about China. And some of these, journalists are kind of ignored when it comes to, let's say, conferences like this one. You don't see them attending such conferences. Why? Because they work for a religious media, or two, because they work for a community media that is underfunded. Yet within those local communities, we have the Chinese that are actually doing something. And I believe that that could be a start of their reporting. Because these people see the Chinese working, but it doesn't come to their mind that they could actually write a story about them. Why? Because there's always an aspect of a routine story in their mind. So yes, I agree with you. I think it's a very challenging thing. But then also I think, it's just the idea of being able to continue to talk about it and be able to, conscientize them in terms of what could be done. The idea of also disclosure, yes, that's very true. And I know two journalists actually that started pursuing the story, and the government responded that it was a matter of national security, and they asked them not to actually pursue that story, even when, we knew it, but we didn't know the content of that. How that could be addressed, honestly, I don't know. I think it's a very challenging thing. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I have maybe two questions. The first one is, as you're showing, there is less coverage of China in the sort of more mainstream media.
Yes.
Is it very different when you look at social media? And also, when it happens in social media, in which languages? That's the first question. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, I agree with you about the gap of, the knowledge gap between local journalists and opportunities, like we have this wonderful opportunity today to come and share and learn. But do you think that, for example, exposing those journalists who are still willing to cover China, if we provided them with content from, let's say, VOA China in English, mm-hmm. or China Digital Times content, at least as a sort of introduction to China issues, is that realistic at all, or that wouldn't work? Sort of showing them there is alternative content, at least in English,
yes,
about China, maybe not directly related to Zambia, which of course would be a problem, but maybe at least to understand, to have a sort of exposure to, there are other ways to talk about China, or this is where you can get alternative knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I'll start with your second question, and I think you're very right about that. Because when the thing is, when people, let's say we meet and talk about China, everything sounds negative. But we have these Chinese people, like in rural Solwezi, which I'm talking about, that are doing, gardening or farming, and in one or the other, they're actually training the locals to garden. I think that would be a start. If local journalists can report on that, then they'll have the courage or the knowledge to report on abuses that happen in that case. So just having that opportunity for them to actually start understanding what China is doing in their local communities. And then with social media, yes, the presence of China is very present in social media, but among individuals. So it's where somebody finds something, reports it, sends it out, like the video I showed. And some of these things, like you saw, is a serious case that would make a very good story. Somebody, Haggai was just telling you about something that happened in Uganda, and which no one actually pursued. He went through no mainstream media pursued, and it's newsworthy. It was done by a Chinese, So that's the question. It's like, yes, it's on social media, people know about it, but what is the media doing about it? Yeah, I don't know if I've answered the question. Yes, yeah, you have.
I'm Marta from Ecuador. I'm investigative journalist.
Yeah.
What I want to tell the person that asked first is that sometimes a lack of access to information is also information. Uh-huh. And we had covered China. We began investigating these things, among other corruption issues in Ecuador, like 15 years ago. And there was, I remember, a 4-part agreement that nobody could read, not even the national prosecutor, nobody. Not even Ecuadorian legislatures. Nobody had access to that. And that was mentioned in all the other memorandums of understanding and all the other contracts. That was the top norm, but nobody could read that. And also the debt contracts, contrary to Ecuadorian law. In Ecuadorian law, you have a period where it's secret what you are negotiating, but once you sign the contract, the debt contract, or if you are putting bonds in the market, everything must be transparent, except with China. With China, they said that they would be published and known once you have finished paying, which is ridiculous. But we made an issue of that. And we, as journalists, and investigative journalists, make an issue and a constant complaint and public complaint about the lack of transparency. So I think that one interesting thing to maybe say to you from our experience in Ecuador, now we have a lot of investigations about corruptions in several projects in Ecuador, and there are some companies and even former Chinese ambassador that has been presented charges by the prosecutors in Ecuador. The thing is that you have make an issue that you don't have access to information, not just not to report anymore, because that is very, a gal from, very young journalist from Honduras told me last night that there was this big ceremony and the mayor of a big city, Honduras, was signing a contract with the Chinese company. So she asked for the contract. They had a picture of them signing the contract. And they respond to the journalist, what contract? There is no contract. So she said, you made a photo about signing a contract that there is not, and you say that there is no contract. So that is also news.
Yeah, thank you, yeah. I mean, that's very true. And I think what we're seeing is also an increase in, conspiracy and misinformation. And I think that is also created by the absence or the lack of transparency. I think that's the question that we've always had. What does China want? Because that has not been declared. Why? Because there's this secrecy that we not, that goes around or comes with them. And our governments are embracing that secrecy. So some of the contracts might be genuine, except that they are not telling us what is happening. And then, we end up speculating. And if I speculate, I make assumptions, and it goes to somebody else. I think somebody else might misinterpret it and say, this is what is happening with China. But what we can do is just make inferences. For example, if a government media is 100% owned by China, it follows that content will be, content will be controlled. Because also in the contract, at least we know that they said they'll control or collect advertising revenue for the next 25 years, starting 2017, if I'm not mistaken. So probably that was extended from 25 years to now 50 years. And we know if somebody actually controls revenue, then they also control the content. Yeah. Okay. Unless there's a question, but thank you so much.